The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Astoria Palace as 12-year-old Prince Alexander walked quietly through the grand hallways. Unlike other boys his age who might run or shout, Alexander moved with careful steps, his thoughtful green eyes taking in everything around him. He was small for his age, with sandy brown hair that never quite stayed in place, no matter how much his attendants tried to tame it. Captain James Morrison had been watching over Prince Alexander for 3 years now. At 35, Morrison was the youngest person ever to lead the Royal Guard, a position he had earned through years of dedicated service and unwavering loyalty to the crown. He was tall and strong, with kind brown eyes that missed nothing. The other guards respected him, but more importantly, Prince Alexander trusted him completely. Morrison had served the royal family since he was 18, working his way up from a simple guard to his current position. He took pride in his work, but his relationship with young Alexander was special. The prince was not like other royal children Morrison had heard about in stories. Alexander was curious about the world, kind to everyone he met, and surprisingly wise for someone so young. Every morning, Morrison would accompany Alexander to his lessons. The prince studied history, mathematics, languages, and royal protocol. But Alexander's favorite time was when Morrison would tell him stories about the common people in their kingdom. Morrison came from a simple farming family and had grown up understanding the struggles of ordinary citizens. "Captain Morrison," Alexander said one morning as they walked toward the library, "do you ever miss your old life? Before you came to serve at the palace?" Morrison considered the question carefully. He had learned that the young prince asked questions not out of simple curiosity, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the world and the people in it. "Sometimes, Your Highness," Morrison replied honestly. "I miss the simplicity of it. But serving your family has given my life great purpose and meaning." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "My father says that service to others is the highest calling. But sometimes I wonder if the people we serve really understand what we sacrifice for them." This was the kind of conversation that made Morrison realize just how special Prince Alexander was. Most 12-year-olds were thinking about games and fun, but Alexander was already contemplating the weight of responsibility and service. The kingdom of Astoria was going through difficult times. Economic struggles had left many families without enough food or proper housing. The people looked to the royal family for leadership and hope, but some critics questioned whether the monarchy was still relevant in modern times. These criticisms rarely reached the palace directly, but Morrison, who still maintained connections with people from his hometown, heard the whispers and concerns. King William, Alexander's father, was a good man who truly cared about his people. But he was often overwhelmed by the complex political and economic challenges facing the kingdom. Queen Isabella, Alexander's mother, was beloved by the people for her charity work, but she worried constantly about preparing her son for the tremendous responsibility he would one day inherit. Morrison often watched Alexander during public appearances, noting how the young prince observed everything with those thoughtful green eyes. At charity events, Alexander would insist on speaking with the people receiving help, asking them about their lives and their needs. He never seemed to be performing for cameras or trying to look good for the press. His interest appeared genuine and deep. One afternoon, Morrison found Alexander sitting alone in the palace gardens, looking unusually troubled. The prince was holding a newspaper that he had somehow obtained, despite his parents' efforts to shield him from negative press coverage. "Your Highness, is everything all right?" Morrison asked, sitting down beside the prince on the stone bench. Alexander handed him the newspaper. The headline read, "Royal Family Out of Touch While Citizens Struggle." The article criticized the expensive lifestyle of the royal family and questioned whether the monarchy was worth the cost to taxpayers during such difficult economic times. "Captain Morrison, do you think they're right?" Alexander asked quietly. Do you think we're really helping our people, or are we just a burden? Morrison felt his heart ache for the young prince. At 12 years old, Alexander was already carrying the weight of these complex moral questions. Your Highness, leadership is never simple, Morrison said carefully. People will always have different opinions about how things should be done. What matters is that you keep asking these questions and that you never stop caring about finding the right answers. Alexander looked up at him with those wise green eyes. But how do we know if we're making the right choices? How do we know if we're truly serving the people or just serving ourselves? Morrison realized in that moment that Prince Alexander was far more mature and thoughtful than anyone in the palace truly understood. The prince was not just learning about his future responsibilities. He was already feeling the full weight of them. Your Highness, the fact that you're asking these questions tells me that when your time comes to lead, you'll do so with wisdom and compassion, Morrison said. Not every leader has the courage to question their own actions and motivations. Over the following weeks, Morrison noticed changes in Alexander. The prince began asking more questions about the lives of the palace staff. He wanted to know about their families, their concerns, and their dreams. Alexander started visiting the palace kitchens, the gardens, and the maintenance areas, speaking with people who had never expected a prince to show interest in their work. The prince also began asking Morrison to tell him more detailed stories about life outside the palace walls. Alexander wanted to understand what it meant to worry about paying bills, to struggle to find work, or to face the challenges that ordinary families dealt with every day. Morrison found himself in an unusual position. As captain of the royal guard, his duty was to protect and serve the royal family. But as someone who had grown up among common people, he also felt a responsibility to help Alexander understand the reality of their lives. One evening, as they walked through the palace halls after Alexander's evening lessons, the prince stopped suddenly. Captain Morrison, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, Alexander said, his young voice carrying an unusual gravity. Morrison stopped and turned to face the prince, giving him his full attention. If you had to choose between protecting me and doing what was truly best for our people, what would you choose? Alexander asked. Morrison felt the weight of the question settle over him like a heavy blanket. This was not the kind of question a 12-year-old should be asking, but Prince Alexander was not an ordinary 12-year-old. Your Highness, I believe that protecting you and doing what's best for the people are the same thing, Morrison replied carefully. You are going to be a great leader someday, someone who will truly serve the people with wisdom and compassion. Alexander shook his head slowly. But what if they weren't the same thing? What if there came a time when those two duties conflicted with each other? Morrison looked into the prince's serious green eyes and realized that Alexander was not asking a hypothetical question. Somehow, this thoughtful young prince was already seeing possibilities and challenges that the adults around him had not yet considered. Your Highness, I hope that day never comes, Morrison said quietly. But if it did, I would trust you to help me find the right answer. Alexander nodded slowly. But Morrison could see that the prince was not entirely satisfied with his response. There was something brewing in Alexander's thoughtful mind, something that Morrison could not quite understand yet. As they reached Alexander's chambers, the prince turned to Morrison one more time. Captain, do you think it's possible for someone to serve others better by stepping away from power than by holding on to it? Morrison felt a chill run down his spine at the question, though he could not explain why. I think, Your Highness, that the greatest leaders are those who put service above personal ambition, no matter what form that service takes. Alexander smiled for the first time that evening, but it was a sad, wise smile that seemed far too old for his young face. Thank you, Captain Morrison. You always help me think through difficult things. As Morrison left the prince's chambers that night, He could not shake the feeling that something significant was building toward a moment that would change everything. Prince Alexander was growing up faster than anyone realized, and the questions he was asking suggested that he was preparing for choices that even adults would find difficult to make. The turning point came on a cold Tuesday morning in late autumn. Prince Alexander had been unusually quiet for several days, spending long hours in his private study reading books about history, philosophy, and governance. Captain Morrison had noticed the change, but had not pressed the prince to explain his thoughtful mood. That morning, Alexander approached Morrison with a request that surprised everyone in the palace. "Captain Morrison, I want to visit the Riverside district," Alexander said simply. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. The Riverside district was the poorest area of the capital city, where families struggled daily to make ends meet. It was not the kind of place where royal family members typically visited, especially not without extensive planning and security arrangements. "Your Highness, that would require significant preparation," Morrison replied carefully. "The area can be unpredictable, and your safety would need to be our primary concern." Alexander nodded, understanding, but there was a determination in his green eyes that Morrison had never seen before. "I understand the concerns, Captain, but I need to see how our people really live, not during a planned royal visit with prepared speeches and clean streets, but the way things actually are every day." Morrison found himself in a difficult position. His duty was to protect the prince, but he also recognized the wisdom in Alexander's request. How could the future king truly understand his people if he only saw them during carefully orchestrated public events? After much discussion with the king and queen, and against their initial wishes, arrangements were made for a very quiet, unofficial visit to the Riverside district. Alexander would go with Morrison and 2 other guards, dressed in simple clothes, with no media attention or formal announcements. The morning of the visit, Alexander met Morrison at the palace's side entrance. The prince was wearing plain brown trousers and a simple jacket, looking more like any other 12-year-old boy than a royal heir. "Are you ready for this, Your Highness?" Morrison asked. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Alexander replied quietly. "I just didn't know it until recently." The drive to Riverside District took 30 minutes, but it felt like traveling to a completely different world. As they moved away from the wealthy areas surrounding the palace, the buildings became older, smaller, and more crowded together. The streets were narrower, and many showed signs of needed repairs. When they arrived, Morrison was struck by how different everything looked from the cleaned-up areas where royal visits usually took place. There was no hiding the reality of poverty here. Children played in streets that needed paving. Elderly people sat on steps of buildings that needed paint. And working-age adults moved with the tired expressions of people struggling to find enough work to support their families. Alexander said nothing as they walked through the district, but Morrison could see the prince taking in every detail. When they passed a small community center, Alexander stopped. "Can we go inside?" he asked. The community center was running a lunch program for children whose families could not afford proper meals. Volunteers were serving soup and bread to dozens of young people, many of whom appeared to be Alexander's age or younger. Alexander approached the woman who seemed to be in charge, a kind-faced lady named Mrs. Chen, who had been volunteering at the center for over 10 years. "Excuse me," Alexander said politely, "could you tell me about what you're doing here?" Mrs. Chen looked at the well-mannered young boy with curiosity. She did not recognize him as the prince, since Alexander was dressed simply and behaving like any other interested child. "We try to make sure the children in this area get at least one good meal each day," Mrs. Chen explained. "Many families are working multiple jobs just to pay rent, and sometimes there isn't enough money left for proper food." Alexander listened carefully to everything Mrs. Chen told him. He asked thoughtful questions about how many children they served, what their biggest challenges were, and what kind of support would help them most. "Would it be all right if I helped serve the food today?" Alexander asked. Mrs. Chen was delighted to have another volunteer, especially such a polite and helpful young person. For the next 2 hours, Alexander worked alongside the other volunteers, serving meals to children who had no idea they were being helped by their future king. Morrison watched from a respectful distance, amazed by what he was seeing. Prince Alexander was not just going through the motions of charitable work. He was genuinely connecting with each child, learning their names, asking about their interests, and treating each person with real respect and attention. During a break, Alexander sat with a group of children around his own age. Morrison could hear him asking them about their schools, their families, and their dreams for the future. The children responded to Alexander's genuine interest with openness and trust. One boy named David told Alexander about how his mother worked 3 jobs to support their family, but they still struggled to pay for his school supplies. A girl named Maria explained that she wanted to become a teacher someday, but worried that her family could never afford to send her to university. Alexander listened to every story with complete attention, asking follow-up questions and remembering details about each child's situation. When it was time to leave, Alexander thanked Mrs. Chen and the other volunteers for letting him help. Several of the children asked if he would come back again, and Alexander promised that he would. The drive back to the palace was quiet. Morrison could see that Alexander was processing everything he had experienced, but the prince did not speak until they were almost back to the royal grounds. "Captain Morrison, how many children like David and Maria are there in our kingdom?" Alexander asked. "Too many, Your Highness," Morrison replied honestly. "And how much money does the palace spend each month on things that aren't really necessary?" Alexander continued. Morrison felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but he had promised to always be honest with the prince. "The palace expenses are considerable, Your Highness. Much of it goes to maintaining the buildings, paying staff, and supporting various royal functions." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "But some of it goes to things that are more about luxury than necessity, doesn't it?" Morrison could not deny this. The royal family lived very comfortably, with expenses for fine food, expensive clothes, elaborate ceremonies, and luxurious furnishings that far exceeded what any ordinary family could afford. "Yes, Your Highness. Some expenses could be considered luxury items." For the next several days, Alexander was quieter than usual. He continued with his regular lessons and duties, but Morrison could see that the prince's mind was working through complex ideas and emotions. A week after their visit to Riverside District, Alexander asked to speak privately with his parents. Morrison was not present for this conversation, but he could hear raised voices coming from the king's study, something that rarely happened in the usually peaceful palace. Later that evening, King William summoned Morrison to his office. The king looked tired and troubled. "Captain Morrison, my son has made a request that concerns his mother and me greatly," the king began. "Alexander wants to significantly reduce the royal family's personal expenses and redirect that money toward helping families in need." Morrison waited respectfully for the king to continue. "He's asking us to sell some of the royal jewels, reduce the staff, eliminate expensive ceremonies, and change how we live in fundamental ways," King William continued. "He says he wants to set an example of service and sacrifice." Morrison could hear both pride and worry in the king's voice. "What troubles you about this request, Your Majesty?" Morrison asked carefully. "Alexander is only 12 years old," the king replied. "These are not decisions a child should be making. Royal traditions and ceremonies serve important purposes. They maintain respect for the monarchy and provide stability for the kingdom." Morrison understood the king's concerns, but he also recognized the wisdom in Prince Alexander's thinking. "Your Majesty, If I may speak freely, Prince Alexander has shown remarkable maturity and genuine concern for your people. Perhaps his ideas deserve serious consideration." King William studied Morrison's face carefully. "Captain, you've spent more time with my son than anyone outside our immediate family. Do you think he truly understands what he's asking for?" Morrison thought about all his conversations with Alexander, the prince's thoughtful questions, and the genuine compassion he had seen the boy show toward others. "Your Majesty, I believe Prince Alexander understands these issues better than many adults. He's not making these suggestions lightly or from childish idealism. He's thinking deeply about what it means to truly serve his people." The king was quiet for a long moment. "The problem, Captain, is that if we follow Alexander's suggestions, we may undermine the very institution he's supposed to inherit. Royal authority partly depends on maintaining certain traditions and appearances." Morrison realized that this was the heart of the conflict. Prince Alexander was proposing changes that would challenge fundamental aspects of how the monarchy operated, but his motivations came from a genuine desire to better serve his people. "Your Majesty, what if Prince Alexander is right? What if the monarchy could be stronger by being more connected to and concerned with the daily lives of ordinary citizens?" Morrison suggested. King William looked at Morrison with surprise. "Captain, are you suggesting that a 12-year-old boy has a better understanding of royal duty than generations of kings and queens who came before him?" Morrison felt the weight of the moment. His answer would either support Prince Alexander's vision or align him with traditional royal thinking. "Your Majesty, I'm suggesting that Prince Alexander may be seeing possibilities that previous generations didn't consider because times have changed. The people's needs and expectations are different now." The conversation continued for another hour, with King William expressing his concerns about precedent, tradition, and the potential consequences of dramatic changes to royal customs. Morrison found himself defending Prince Alexander's ideas more strongly than he had initially intended. When Morrison finally left the king's office, he realized that a line had been drawn. Prince Alexander was proposing a new vision of what royal service could look like, and Morrison had chosen to support that vision, even though it put him in potential conflict with the current king and queen. The next morning, Alexander sought out Morrison with a serious expression. "Captain, I know my parents talked to you about my suggestions," Alexander said. "I also know that supporting my ideas might make your position here difficult." Morrison looked at the thoughtful 12-year-old who was already understanding complex political dynamics. "Your Highness, my position is to serve the crown with honor. If that means supporting what I believe is right, even when it's difficult, then that's what I must do." Alexander smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Captain Morrison, I think we both know that the path I want to take is going to require sacrifices from everyone involved. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Morrison realized that Prince Alexander was giving him a chance to step back from supporting ideas that could fundamentally change the monarchy. But looking at this remarkable young person, Morrison knew he could not abandon his conviction that Alexander's vision of service was right. "Your Highness, I am prepared to support what I believe is the right path, whatever the consequences." Alexander nodded slowly, and Morrison could see both gratitude and sorrow in the prince's green eyes. "Then we both know what's coming, don't we, Captain?" The final chapter of Captain Morrison's service to the royal family began on a quiet Sunday morning 3 weeks after his conversation with Prince Alexander. The palace was unusually tense, with whispered conversations among the staff and worried expressions on familiar faces. King William had been meeting with his advisors for days, discussing the implications of Prince Alexander's proposed changes to royal customs and spending. The discussions had not gone well. Traditional advisors argued that such dramatic changes would weaken the monarchy's authority and set dangerous precedents. They worried that reducing royal ceremonies and luxury would make the crown appear less dignified and important in the eyes of both citizens and foreign leaders. Queen Isabella was caught between her husband's concerns about royal tradition and her recognition that their son possessed unusual wisdom and compassion. She had seen Alexander's genuine care for their people, but she also feared that his idealistic vision might put the entire royal institution at risk. Morrison found Alexander in the palace library that Sunday morning, surrounded by books about constitutional monarchy, economic policy, and social reform. The prince looked up as Morrison approached, and there was a weariness in his young eyes that should not have existed in someone so young. "Good morning, Captain Morrison," Alexander said quietly. "I've been reading about other royal families who tried to reform their traditions. Some succeeded in creating stronger connections with their people. Others lost their thrones entirely." Morrison sat down across from the prince, noting the heavy responsibility that seemed to rest on Alexander's small shoulders. "Your Highness, are you having second thoughts about your proposals?" Morrison asked gently. Alexander closed the book he had been reading and looked directly at Morrison. "No, Captain. I'm more convinced than ever that we need to change how we serve our people, but I'm also beginning to understand the full cost of that change." Before Morrison could respond, a palace aide approached with a message that King William wanted to see both of them immediately in his private study. When they arrived, they found the king standing by the window, looking out at the palace gardens. His usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and Morrison could see the weight of difficult decisions in his posture. "Alexander, Captain Morrison, please sit down," King William said without turning around. They took seats in the comfortable chairs near the king's desk, and Alexander reached over to briefly touch Morrison's hand in what seemed like a gesture of support and farewell. King William finally turned to face them, his expression serious but not unkind. "My son, I have given extensive consideration to your proposals," the king began. "I have consulted with advisors, studied historical precedents, and prayed for wisdom in making this decision." Alexander sat perfectly still, but Morrison could see the prince preparing himself for disappointment. "Alexander, your ideas come from a good heart and a genuine desire to serve our people better," King William continued. "However, the advisors are unanimous in their belief that implementing your suggestions would seriously damage the monarchy's stability and effectiveness." Morrison felt his heart sink as he realized what was coming next. "Therefore, I have decided that we cannot make the changes you have proposed," the king said firmly. "The royal family will continue to maintain traditional customs, ceremonies, and levels of expenditure that are appropriate to our position." Alexander nodded slowly, showing no surprise at his father's decision. Morrison realized that the prince had been preparing for this outcome. "I understand, father," Alexander said quietly. "You have to do what you believe is best for the kingdom." King William's expression softened as he looked at his son. "Alexander, when you are older and have more experience, you may understand the complexities involved in these decisions differently." "Perhaps," Alexander replied. "Or perhaps I'll still believe that true leadership requires us to live the same values we ask our people to embrace." The king turned his attention to Morrison. "Captain, my advisors have also expressed concern about your support for my son's ideas. They feel that as head of the royal guard, you should prioritize maintaining royal authority rather than encouraging changes that could undermine it." Morrison felt the moment he had been dreading arriving. "Your Majesty, I have always served the crown with complete loyalty and dedication." "I don't question your loyalty, Captain," King William said. "But I need to know that you can support my decision to maintain our current approach to royal duties and traditions." Morrison looked at Prince Alexander, who was watching him with those wise green eyes. Then he looked back at King William, a man he had served faithfully for years. Your Majesty, I have the deepest respect for your authority and your dedication to the kingdom, Morrison said carefully. However, I cannot in good conscience oppose what I believe to be a better path for serving our people. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of irreversible change. King William nodded slowly, sadness evident in his expression. Captain Morrison, you have served this family with honor and distinction for many years. I had hoped we could find a way to work through this disagreement. As did I. Your Majesty, Morrison replied, but sometimes our deepest convictions require us to make difficult choices. Prince Alexander spoke for the first time in several minutes. Father, Captain Morrison's only crime is believing in the same vision of service that I do. If anyone should face consequences for these ideas, it should be me, not him. King William looked at his 12-year-old son with a mixture of pride and exasperation. Alexander, Captain Morrison is an adult who makes his own choices. You are my son, and someday you will be king. We will work through our disagreements as a family. Morrison realized that the king was offering him one last opportunity to change his position. Your Majesty, if I may speak candidly, Prince Alexander's vision of leadership is not naive idealism. It's a mature understanding of what true service means. I cannot pretend to believe otherwise. King William was quiet for a long moment, then walked over to his desk and pulled out an official document. Captain Morrison, it is with genuine regret that I must accept your resignation from the position of head of the Royal Guard, effective immediately. Morrison had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. He had dedicated half his life to serving the royal family. Your Majesty, I resign my position with deep respect for you personally and continued loyalty to the crown, Morrison said formally. Alexander stood up abruptly, tears beginning to form in his eyes. This isn't fair. Captain Morrison shouldn't have to give up his career because he supported my ideas. Morrison stood and placed a gentle hand on Alexander's shoulder. Your Highness, this isn't punishment. This is about maintaining integrity. I couldn't continue in a position where I had to act against my convictions about what's right. King William watched the exchange between his son and Morrison with evident emotion. Captain, you will receive full honors and benefits appropriate to your years of distinguished service. A position will be found for you elsewhere if you desire it. Thank you, Your Majesty. Your generosity is much appreciated, Morrison replied. Alexander looked up at Morrison with tears now flowing freely down his face. Captain, I'm sorry that believing in my ideas cost you so much. Morrison knelt down to Alexander's eye level. Your Highness, supporting what you believe to be right never costs too much. Someday, when you are king, you will have the opportunity to implement the changes you envision. When that day comes, remember that leadership requires both courage and wisdom. Will I see you again? Alexander asked. I hope so, Your Highness. And when you become king, if you ever need advice from someone who believes in your vision of service, you will know where to find me. Morrison stood and saluted King William one final time. Your Majesty, it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve the royal family. King William returned the salute with evident emotion. Captain Morrison, you are a man of principle, and I respect you for that, even though I disagree with your position. 2 weeks later, Morrison was packing his belongings from his quarters in the palace when Prince Alexander came to visit him. The prince had been quieter than usual since Morrison's resignation, spending long hours alone and showing little interest in his usual activities. Captain Morrison, I wanted to give you something before you leave, Alexander said, holding out a small wrapped package. Morrison opened it carefully and found a simple leather-bound journal with Alexander's personal seal embossed on the cover. I wrote down some of my thoughts about leadership and service, Alexander explained. I thought that someday, When I become king and try to implement the changes we talked about, you might want to remember that this all started with our conversations. Morrison felt tears forming in his own eyes as he looked at this remarkable young person who was already thinking about the kind of leader he wanted to become. "Your Highness, this means more to me than I can express," Morrison said. Alexander stepped closer and, breaking royal protocol, gave Morrison a quick hug. "Captain, promise me that when I become king, you'll come back and help me figure out how to truly serve our people." Morrison hugged the prince back, knowing that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Your Highness, I promise that when you are ready to lead with the wisdom and compassion you've already shown, I will be honored to serve that vision in whatever way I can." As Morrison left the palace for the final time as captain of the Royal Guard, he carried with him not bitterness or regret, but pride in having supported a young prince who possessed the courage to imagine a better way of leading. Years later, when Prince Alexander eventually became King Alexander and implemented many of the reforms he had envisioned as a 12-year-old boy, Morrison was there to witness the ceremony. The kingdom had indeed become stronger through a monarchy that truly served its people with humility, compassion, and sacrifice. Morrison never regretted his decision to resign with grace rather than compromise his convictions. He had learned that sometimes the greatest service requires letting go of positions and titles in order to remain faithful to higher principles. And King Alexander never forgot the captain who had believed in his vision when no one else would, teaching him that true leadership sometimes means standing alone for what you believe is right, even when the cost is high.